Marx's critique of the Gotha program contains some of his most explicit comments on the nature of a communist society, the nature of a transition from one mode of production to another, and the challenges of achieving real equality and freedom within a newly created communist society. It also captures some of Marx's ideas about revolutionary organization. For these reasons, it remains a much read and discussed work today, outliving the particular historical circumstances of its writing. These historical circumstances are as follows. In 1875, two organizations met in Gotha, Germany, with the intent of merging their organizations into one. On one side was the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany, also known as the Eisenachers. Marx and Engels were hugely influential on the Eisenachers. On the other side was the General German Workers' Association, who were followers of Ferdinand Lassalle. These two sides drafted a program for a united party, which was then sent to Marx for comments. Marx had long been a critic of Lassalle's ideas, and he immediately saw this program as a theoretical retrogression for the Eisenachers, because it was filled with Lassallean influence. Although the unification of these two organizations was to form an unprecedentedly large workers' party, Marx vehemently opposed the program and the unification. He charged that the program was a theoretical regression, quote, a monstrous attack on the understanding that is spread amongst the mass of our party, end quote, and that there should be no bargaining about principles. On today's episode of Radio Free Humanity, we discuss why Marx thought that building the size of the party was not worth making sacrifices on theoretical principles. And we discuss his notion of the higher and lower phase of communism, the problematic notion of transitional society that is sometimes read into this work, and the question of how Marx envisioned a break with the law of value. You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
To hear more episodes, read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please do visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. Please also consider making a donation to the podcast there at that website. While our podcast is hosted by Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. If you're looking for the podcast on Apple Podcast, iTunes, or some other podcast hosting platform, try typing in the full name of our podcast. That's Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. You can also find our RSS feed at Marxist-Humanistinitiative.org. On today's episode, a far-ranging conversation with myself and Andrew about Marx's critique of the Gotha program. But before that, we're going to take a few minutes, as we do in every episode, to discuss some current events in today's news. For our current events section today, we're going to be talking about two topics. First, we're going to cover the Senate impeachment trial of Donald J. Trump, and then we're going to move on to a discussion of Joe Rogan's endorsement of Bernie Sanders and how the Sandinistas left has responded to that. We are recording this current events segment on the 27th of January, several days before the podcast is released, and who knows what sort of changes will happen in this dramatic impeachment trial. There were just revelations today about a book by John Bolton and how there's speculation that that might cause some senators to change their mind about the need for witnesses. However, even if witnesses testify, it's very likely that this entire outcome is predetermined, that the Republican Senate will find a way to cover everything up and to absolve Trump of all responsibility. And it very much feels like the end of the rule of law and democracy in this country.
Where do we stand then? What do we do? I mean, effectively, if that happens, the United States is no longer a democratic country, right? And people are saying, well, the voters will decide, but the voters are deciding, first of all, in a rigged election where he's inviting foreign influence very clearly, and the Senate just said, yeah, that's cool, it's because it's foreign influence that benefits us, right? You got that. And then the other thing that really troubles me about this idea of letting the voters decide is voters don't decide on the facts concerning these articles of impeachment. They decide, well, gee, I'm a white nationalist and he's good for the white nationalists, and I like fetuses and he's good for fetuses, and I like tax cuts and he's giving me tax cuts. Voters don't decide on the issues that the Senate is supposed to be deciding on. And for them to abdicate like this is just, there's nothing to me that is more clear as a statement that the rule of law does not matter anymore. The facts, justice does not matter. It's all politics, and it's all, can you get people to like you through whatever political and monetary favors you throw their way. I think it's absolutely horrid. I mean, and the Democrats haven't even made this argument. They made the argument, well, you're letting the accused rig the election and then let the voters decide in a rigged election. I mean, that's all valid, but even if we don't have that, what is going to compel 140 million voters to all act as if they're jurors rather than voters? Okay, and if they act as voters rather than jurors, then there is not the voters are not trying Trump, and then that means that the Senate's basically at best kicking it over. So it means basically, if people like you, you can commit any crime you want. I mean, that is, to me, that is like the end of the rule of law. And don't talk to me about your laws, and don't talk to me about having to do politics according to certain rules. Those rules do not exist. That's my view, and I think it's become palpably clearer at this point. But the real question is, okay, what do we do? Do we go down this road of trying to win an election when it's so rigged, or do we say, there are still ways of getting Trump out that just size up the situation we're in and say, the rule of law does not exist any longer. Fair elections do not exist any longer. This is not any longer a democratic country if they let this guy off the hook like this. And we have to fight back by other means.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before in the podcast about how we can't just rely on the politics of persuasion. We're not going to save the rule of law by writing to senators or calling senators. We really need to be organizing a mass base of opposition against Trump outside of the normal two-party electoral system. We see it happen in other places. We saw mass movements in Puerto Rico last year taking out elected officials. We need something on that kind of level in this country if we're going to really deal with the Trump problem. But at the moment, I don't see that happening, and it's kind of depressing. It feels hopeless.
Right. I mean, that's the thing, though. Everybody's hopeless, and as long as we're hopeless, we don't act. And we don't act individually because we're waiting for other people to act. But if we all start to act, then that can turn things around in a moment. I mean, I think that this is the one thing that really, really upsets me about the Democrats is that they just don't have the perspective and don't have the ability, politics in any manner other than, electorally. The Democrats don't do anything to try to encourage a mass opposition that's in any way independent of them, and as a result, they're in this situation where everybody is just like sitting back, hopeless, because the Democrats can't pull it off. The Republicans, haven't acted this way. The Republicans had the Tea Party, they got their militias, they got their Fox News, they got the whole thing, and the Democrats and the so-called left, they just drop the ball continually. I mean, I understand why the Democrats do it. They're tied to corporate interests and everything like that. But still, it's not like there are no opportunities here. It's just there's a lack of political vision, a lack of political will.
So we're going to pivot now. Maybe that's an appropriate segue to talking about Joe Rogan's endorsement of Bernie Sanders and the celebration of this endorsement by people and some of the people in the Sanders camp. Joe Rogan is an alt-right podcaster, sometimes referred to as a gateway to the alt-right. He's known to be quite transphobic, to make racist comments, and to frequently platform white nationalists on his podcast. Bernie Sanders did an interview on Joe Rogan's podcast last year, and just a couple of days ago, Rogan has come out endorsing Sanders, and the Sanders campaign celebrated this endorsement by retweeting Rogan's endorsement. Some have called on Sanders' campaign to disavow the endorsement and to apologize for celebrating it, but others, like Jacobin magazine, have celebrated this as proof of Sanders' successful socialist strategy, a strategy that can cross the ideological divide. Of course, at Jacobin, everything Bernie Sanders does is met uncritically with parades and ticker tape. I'm sure in a couple of weeks they're going to start referring to him as the fearless leader or something. But we've been talking about the dangers of left economic populism on this podcast, and MHI has talked about this a lot. It's dangerous it's dangerous because it fails to take seriously the dangers of pandering to reactionary elements of society. And this whole issue seems to be a real vindication of what we've been warning about for several years now, that there's a real danger of a red-brown alliance developing out of this left economic populism. Indeed, Jacobin's take on Joe Rogan's endorsement was not dissimilar from Richard Spencer, the famous white nationalist who tweeted about the same issue. He tweeted today, or a couple of days ago, quote, "Joe Rogan is the center of American politics and exactly the type of person a working class political movement should seek to attract."
I saw an article in Forbes magazine, and they quoted Bhaskar Sunkara, who's like the head of Jacobin. I don't know his official title. And he called Rogan, quote, "the best endorsement Bernie Sanders could hope for. His fans are a group of people we can't afford to cede to Trump." You know, the fact that Rogan endorses Sanders is not the issue. Even if Sanders had said nothing instead of outright disavowed the endorsement, that would have been different than what they did, which was to celebrate it. And now you have, all the people around him, around Sanders, trying to provide arguments for this. And that even makes it worse because the arguments are all, let's win over these people. But you're winning them over without challenging what's so abhorrent about their ideology and, their hatred. And that's the other thing that really bothered me about that piece in Jacobin, is it made this issue of trans people into a difference in policy views. This is not a difference in policy views. This is hatred of people because of who they are. Okay, you can have disagreements with people about policy. I want more entitlement programs. I want less entitlement programs. I want this kind of foreign policy. I want that kind of foreign policy. Those are policy views. Hatred of people because they're trans or they're black or they're whatever. You're talking about something different, and the fact that they don't see it or refuse to see it is extremely troubling.
I thought there was a piece back in August of last year in Jacobin by Luc Savage that came out right after Sanders went on the Joe Rogan show. And the sort of blurb at the top of the piece, I think, encapsulates a lot of the problem. It says, "Bernie Sanders' viral appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast showcased his unique ability to communicate left-wing values across the ideological divide." And just this framing of what is a left-wing value, I thought, is really illustrative of the problem here. They're saying that confronting racism, transphobia, homophobia, those sort of things are not left-wing values. Those are like sort of these distracting social issues that distract us from the real left-wing values, which are, redistributionist, social democratic politics, and that the ability to attract people with reactionary views to your party by promising more social democracy, that's the real left-wing strategy, and that we can just ignore all the racism and reaction because it's sort of a distraction from the real issues that leftists should be dealing with. I mean, that's really what is being argued, although it's not completely explicit. It's close to explicit.
My major takeaway initially was yours. It's like this just shows the moral bankruptcy of any conception of socialism in which it consists exclusively or predominantly of entitlement programs, rather than like Marx's conception, where the free development of each person, the free development of each person is the condition for the free development of all. That's what Marx fought his whole life for. That just it doesn't get reflected in what these people call socialism. It's a very economistic, narrow, programmatic kind of thing, and it's just very hard to relate to those kinds of people. Of course, they don't really want to relate to us. They want to relate to the Joe Rogan audience.
Well, on that note, we're going to transition to our discussion of the critique of the Gotha program and Marx's vision of socialism. So I have a friend, and he has a T-shirt that says, "Labor is the source of all value." And every time I see his T-shirt, I think of the opening paragraphs to Marx's critique of the Gotha program, where Marx has a field day beating up on these Lassalleans for this very sloppy theoretical construction when they start off with this line, "Labor is the source of all wealth and culture."
Yeah, it's not TC.
TC?
It's not TC. It's not theoretically correct. Yeah.
I see. So every time I see the T-shirt, I think, should I be correcting him on this theoretical detail, or is this completely unimportant?
Well, look. It's one thing, as a slogan on a T-shirt. It's another thing in a political program.
Well, that's what I wanted to get at first here. I think that if someone's reading the Gotha critique for the first time, or maybe even the 10th time, they're likely struck at the degree of Marx's irritation with the program and the detail of his critique, which extends to very minute sort of theoretical details and details of word choices and paragraphs. And one is maybe left wondering, is this just sort of the curmudgeon-y, carbuncle-y copy editor side of Marx, or are there more important principles at stake here?
Well, my view on the matter is he's at that point leading up to something. Okay. And what he's leading up to is that all of these things which just seem to be plain sloppiness and lack of real internalization of theory, particularly the theory that he's already laid out in Capital, the first edition, which was published in 1867, and this program that he's writing a critique of is 8 years later. So it looks like it just might be accidental sloppiness, not paying attention to theory. But I think Marx is leading up to the point that these problems in the text are not accidental. And what they are a capitulation of the so-called Marxist party that's entering into this unification. They're actually capitulating to the Lassalleans, the other group with which they are followers of Ferdinand Lassalle. Okay, so the so-called Marxists or Eisenachers are merging with the Lassalleans, and they're in fact capitulating to them on a theoretical basis. It's not just theoretical sloppiness; it's theoretical capitulation that I think is not just irritating him. I mean, he's opposing the program, he's opposing the unification, and he's just leading into it by saying even the most simple and seemingly innocuous things are just riddled with this conciliationist capitulation all the way through.
Yeah, and these were hard-won theoretical achievements that Marx had worked on for decades, and that Marx and Engels had labored to win people over to these positions and this level of understanding. And now they saw these theoretical achievements being compromised with this regressive backsliding into Lassalleanism.
Yeah, I mean, I would not say that labor is not the source of all wealth is a tremendous theoretical insight that was very hard won. I mean, by itself, it's not that huge of a point. But taken in the context of this program, which eventually is calling for fair distribution of the proceeds of labor and equal right and all of this stuff, And the achievement of all of this, without saying you need a new society before you get it, taken in context, a tremendous amount of Marx's work in particular is implicated in this. It's in effect being just discarded by the program.
Yeah, well, they were hard won, not just in terms of the achievement of a certain level of theory, but also the politics of winning people over to positions.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is, I think, really the importance of the critique of the Gotha program is finally in this document. After decades, everything kind of comes together for Marx. You got the theory, you've got the political practice, and you've got organization specifically. All of them are together, and he's forging, in opposition to the program and the merger, the unification, he's forging a whole different basis and saying, I'm opposing this, and all of these things need to be, held tightly together. The theory, the political practice, the organization, and you can't just jettison, throw overboard the theory, opportunistically for the sake of a political merger. One step of real movement is more important, he says, than a dozen programs. Okay. And what he's referring to there is theoretical development. The real movement is the theoretical development of the working class movement and the proletarian organizations and so forth.
Ryadunievskaya writes that a lot of the post-Marxists extolled Lassalle and considered him this organizational genius that was able to really build the first giant German workers' party. And they put a lot of emphasis into this idea of party building for its own sake, whereas Marx is opposing this merger in his critique of the Gotha program because he doesn't see it worthwhile to grow the size of the party if it means theoretical retrogression.
Right. He's certainly saying that, and they certainly, in the German social democracy, not only extolled Lassalle and on organizational matters raised him, to a higher level than Marx. I mean, there was actually the idea that okay, Marx was the theory guy and the organization guy was Lassalle, and the founder of our party is Ferdinand Lassalle, because in fact that was the case. That at Gotha, the Eisenach group merged into something that was larger, which was the Lassallean party. So, when Rosa Luxemburg would speak at a public meeting of the party, you'd have this poster on one end of the platform of Marx. That was your theory end, and on the other end of the platform, you'd have the poster of Lassalle. He was the founder of the party. So they tried to have it both ways, right? And since then, of course, everybody's tried to have it both ways. You can have these Marxist beliefs, but the bottom line is you have to merge into this party that is not based on, in any strong sense, not based on these theoretical gains. Yeah.
There's often a real emphasis on size, on recruiting cadre and building numbers, rather than on the development of theoretical ideas. But this also just extends outside of the left to bourgeois political parties in general, that building the mass base is the primary concern and ideas are quite secondary. And in fact, the internal coherence of ideas within the party is not important.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to understand with regard to the Gotha program, Marxist critique, and so forth, is modern political parties did not exist in Marx's day. Really, this merged party was kind of like the first modern party that ever existed. Workers did not have the right to vote, pretty much anywhere. And because of that, you did not have political parties that were representing constituencies and trying to bring people in, as their constituency and so forth. So that idea of a representative political party was not at all part of Marx's conception, and it may not have been, I don't think it was even really part of the conception of the German social democracy, which basically begins at Gotha. It's not just numbers. That's the desire to attract people and gain numbers. That's the problem here. That's part of it, but the other other part is this idea of us trying to win over constituencies and appeal to them where they're at, so to speak, or whatever basis in order to gain those numbers. What a party was for Marx and what a party meant in the environment in which he was living was just completely different from what we now understand a political party to be. A political party is now what we would call more like a political current or political tendency, something more like that. So when Marx is saying, he does this and that in the interest of the party, it's an immediate theoretical conception, or has immediate theoretical implications, because there wasn't this idea like, oh, you do the party stuff and then you do the theory stuff on the side. The party, and the organization are all together in this idea of a political current or political tendency, because the tendency is defined by what it stands for. Whereas we know with a big tent party, it's not defined by what it stands for.
So pivoting a little bit here, one of the things that is interesting about the Gotha critique is Marx has some very insightful things to say about the notion of equality and fairness and what it means to fight for equality and fairness within the confines of a bourgeois society, and what it means for movements to demand equality and fairness within a bourgeois society. The lines from the program that he takes issue with say, quote, "The emancipation of labor demands the promotion of the instruments of labor to the common property of society and the cooperative regulation of the total labor with a fair distribution of the proceeds of labor."
And earlier it begins in its first point by saying that the proceeds of labor belong undiminished with equal right to all members of society. Okay, so this fair distribution is equal right to all members of society.
Right, so what is wrong with this?
Well, he first of all just leans in really heavily on this word fair. And basically, he's saying fair relative to what? And he asks, isn't the present day distribution of the proceeds of labor, in other words, income distribution, isn't the present day under capitalist distribution fair in capitalism's terms, right? And so the real point is, what is the nature of the society that you people are talking about in this program, okay? And what is fair in that kind of society? And that is, I think, the real principle that he's trying to force them to come to grips with in this critique, is one of the fundamental principles of his historical materialism, which is that these different things, the nature of the state and the economy and distribution and all of this stuff, these are not just like separate pieces that you can mix and match. They all go along together. They're a whole. And within that whole, there's a certain structure. And the relations and the forces of production are the foundation of all of this. And corresponding to every different configuration of relations and forces of production, corresponding to these different foundations, you get a different politics, you get a different set of relations of income distribution and so forth. You get different ideologies, you have different systems of law, different ideas of fairness, okay? And they all go along together. So that's what's called correspond. He often uses the term correspond. So he will say, like, the relations of income distribution follow from, arise on the basis of, and correspond to the mode of production, the forces and relations of production. The point is, you can't have relations of production that are at loggerheads with the actual material mode in which you produce, with the kind of technology you have, and the relations at work and the relations between owners and non-owners. All of it has to fit together. And so the critique here of this fair distribution stuff is that they're trying to impose some sort of socialist conception of what's fair, some socialist conception of what's proper and right and lawful on a society that they've said nothing about changing its mode of production, its forces and relations of production. And so it's in this context that Marx issues the very famous line, right, the realm of rights and law, right can never be higher than the economic stage stage of society, or the economic structure of society, and the cultural development that is determined by that. Okay, so he's saying stop talking about distribution like you can substantially change distribution, create equality, and all of this on the basis of capitalist relations of production, capitalist mode of production that you said nothing about. It's not going to be possible. You want fair distribution, you want equal distribution, you want to talk about that, then you have to talk about really profound changes in the character of the society, and then a long process of development within that new society until you could get something like, from each according to their ability to each according to their need.
And this all seems very relevant still today, because so much of the left today is still stuck in this notion of fighting for equality and fairness and freedom and such, all within the confines of capitalist social relations. So even people who call themselves socialists today are still primarily concerned with redistributionist politics and not about something that would actually challenge the mode of production in society.
Right. I mean, in general, to give the other side their due, they basically do not accept this principle of historical materialism that I tried to sketch out a moment ago. They think, the pieces are basically separable and you can mix and match and tinker with things. I've discussed this with lots of people in lots of places for a long time. I just don't think that they are very successful in defending the viability of their proposals in light of the other aspects of capitalist society that continue to exist. For instance, take something like universal basic income. Right. If you gave people income that was sufficient to live, not a really high standard of living, but something that's not keeping them on the edge all the time. If you were to provide that universally with no strings attached within a capitalist society where, people are having to do what the bosses tell them, all the labor is alienated, a lot of it is unsafe, most of it is, at best boring, etc., etc. Okay, you give people income that allows them to avoid this, they are going to avoid it. And then when they avoid it, production comes to a standstill, and this income that the government's going to provide, well, it's not there anymore because there's no there's I don't know if there's any production. It's at a much lower level, and so the tax revenues are much lower. So the whole thing really becomes unworkable. I know they've got their little experiments where you give people a little bit of money and they keep working, but it's a question of a critical mass of money, enough to make people able to live without working. That's the issue here. There have been no experiments where you gave a family of four $40,000, in a community of a few 100,000 people or more for a sustained period of time. Those kinds of experiments. If they did, I think I know what we would see, and it wouldn't be people would just keep working under these conditions of alienated labor and being bossed around. We have a lot of evidence that that's not the case. For instance, when I think it was the auto industry, they first gave workers the possibility of early retirement, I think at 60 instead of age 65. They didn't expect many people to take it, and people took it by the droves. They were like, "Get me out of this hellhole."
Marx moves from this critique of fair distribution to a discussion of what would actually be required to change the mode of production from a capitalist to a communist mode of production. Of course, listeners are probably familiar with the phrase, "from each according to his ability to each according to his needs," which appears in Marx's Critique of the Gotha program. They might not be clear as to why this is a defining feature of what Marx calls the higher phase of communism. They also might not be clear as to how the so-called lower phase of communism still constitutes a break with the capitalist mode of production. In the lower phase, society is not yet ready to organize production and distribution along the ideals of from each according to his ability to each according to their needs. Yet, this lower phase still constitutes a break with capitalism. I thought it might just be helpful to start by just reading a few sentences from his description of the lower phase of communism. He says, within the cooperative society based on the common ownership of the means of production, the producers do not exchange their products. Just as little does the labor employed on the products appear here as the value of these products, as a material quality possessed by them, since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of the total labor. Here he's making it very clear that he sees this notion of indirect labor, which is the hallmark of capitalist society, and direct labor, which is the opposite, and which is a hallmark of pre-capitalist societies and of a communist society, that these two terms, indirectly social and directly social labor, are really at the heart of this question of how to break with capitalism.
Right. And this is related to the other things, the other features, so to speak, of the communist society that he's mentioning here. So he says the labor is expended on the products, no longer appears as the value of the products because labor has become directly rather than indirectly social, and you don't have exchange of products anymore. And again, that's a consequence of labor having become directly social. And then, of course, you've got the common ownership of the means of production, the main things that we use to produce, tools, machines, so forth. All these things are connected.
So I'm sure that you are more prepared than I am to give a succinct definition of indirectly or directly social labor. Can you do that?
Right. Indirectly social is probably the easier to understand. First of all, let's say in modern, capitalist societies, labor is social labor. You're not just producing for yourself, you're producing for others in society. And, when you work, you're working with on materials, raw material supplies that they've created and so forth and so on. We're all interconnected. So the labor is social labor. But it's not directly social in the sense that one's performance of labor doesn't automatically count as social labor, first of all. If you are producing something and the demand for that product suddenly goes away, your labor does not count as social labor.
Because that's because the things you're making are not being used by society.
Yeah, they're no longer wanted, So you produce typewriters, and there's no longer demand for typewriters. You've worked, but that's not social labor. It doesn't count as social labor. Okay, for instance. But beyond just, does it count at all or does it not count at all? There's the question of how much. You do an hour of work. How much work does that count as? How much social labor is your 1 hour of private labor? How much does it count as? And so what we get are lots of issues connected with, somebody works, but they work in the third world with backward technology. They do an hour of work, but it doesn't yield that much product. So what is counting here? How much product they produce or how much work they're doing? And those are two different things. And in capitalist society, how much work they do doesn't matter. How much product they produce matters. It's not the only thing that matters, but it matters rather than the amount of work that they do. And, you've got some people are stronger, more capable for a variety of reasons. They've got special skills that others don't have. Does their hour of labor count as 1 hour of social labor or as more than 1 hour of social labor? Well, we know the answer in capital society. So through a variety of relations, the labor that people do, it's not immediately social. A variety of things come into play to determine how much social labor the 1 hour of an individual's labor counts as. Okay, so there's this indirect process by which the 1 hour of an individual's labor becomes 1 hour, more than 1 hour, less than 1 hour of social labor. Okay, so it's all indirect, assuming that it does count as some amount of social labor at all, that it's not, labor used to produce typewriters, okay, but it's used to, grow, some crop or whatever it might be. It counts as some amount of social labor labor, but 1 hour will not count generally as 1 hour of social labor. And there's this indirect process dependent on a whole variety of factors, whole variety of economic factors in particular, that determines how much social labor an individual's hour of labor counts as.
And this fact that indirectly social labor is a quintessential part of the social relations of capitalism is because labor in a capitalist society doesn't exist just to produce use values, but its primary purpose is to produce things for exchange value. So it has to produce value, economic value, and profit.
Right. And then people ask what value is. Well, I think we can give a sort of shorthand definition of value. Value is abstract wealth, or wealth in the abstract. So we've got various material forms of wealth, that are useful. You can eat food, you can live in housing, you can drive a car. Those are all materially different forms of wealth. Then there's just wealth as such in the abstract. It gets measured by money, but it's independent of any particular form, and it could be associated with the whole gamut of the different material forms of wealth. And so if people are striving to be wealthier in the abstract, what that, translates to in everyday parlance is they want more and more money. Okay. And they want more and more money, not so they will have, just a bigger car, or more cars, bigger home, and so forth. Because a lot of the time they plunk this money into securities and amass the securities and accumulate. So it's an independent goal. It's not just for consumption purposes. So that's some of what value is here.
Right, and that's probably important to bring up since money is such a quintessential feature of a capitalist society in its ability to measure and store value, as opposed to in a communist society or a society based around directly social labor, where the need to measure and store value theoretically should not exist. And so whatever is replacing money is not really performing money functions.
Right. And we were talking about directly and indirectly social labor. And one key property of money is very closely connected, especially in Marx's mind. One key property of money is very connected to the indirect sociality of labor. I mean, if you imagine, let's say, a capitalist society without money, okay, it becomes unimaginable, because if you are going to have a society in which the individual's labor 1 hour does not count as an hour of social labor, you need something that does signify an hour of social labor, okay? And that is what money does. $1 is equal to X amount of social labor. 10 times that amount is equal to 10X social labor, okay? So you're not counting labors, you're counting, in effect, you're counting money, whatever, material forms that money, or electronic forms that money has.
So let's get to this notion of directly social labor. You said you thought that was harder to explain, because I think of it as being in some ways easier to explain in some examples. I mean, if we take, like, I feel like you often hear people use the example of labor within a family unit that is, producing use values for each other, but not there's products not being exchanged, and all of your labor is immediately the social labor of the family unit, say in like a, subsistence farm or something. It's immediately social labor because it's being used, and your labor is never being measured against some abstract standard of efficient labor. That would be directly social labor.
Yes. And I think now that we've talked about indirectly social labor, now it becomes
right.
really easy to talk about
yeah.
directly social labor as its negation, because I agree with everything that you've said about the labor within a family or a peasant household, or all of those are legitimate examples of directly social labor, but they don't relate to this quantitative issue, how much labor one's, individual labor counts as socially, right? I mean, you think of peasants, they within their household, I don't think they kept books, about how much time this one spent on this and how much time this one spent on that. But in, a whole big society that we're talking about here, you do have to keep the books. You do have to have accounting. You do have to have some economic coordination. So the quantitative issue becomes very important. And so what is the quantitative dimension of directly social labor in a big society like that? Well, it becomes very simple to explain now. 1 hour of individual labor directly counts socially without any intervening process. It directly counts socially. 1 hour of an individual's labor counts as 1 hour of social labor. So assuming, all the little things like they're working with the same intensity and so forth. Okay. Yeah.
So then I think what people have to work through to understand is what exactly it means to say that an hour of one's labor counts as an hour of social labor. Here, Marx explains it like this. He says, he receives a certificate from society that he has furnished such and such an amount of labor, and with this certificate he draws from the social stock of means of consumption as much as costs the same amount of labor.
Right. So these are the new relations of distribution that correspond to, using that notion from the historical materialist conception of history. Okay, these are the new relations of distribution. You perform 1 hour of labor, you're entitled to the products of 1 hour of labor. These new relations of distribution correspond to this new mode of production in which labor is directly social. There's no value, there's no money, there's no exchange of products. You see, in this example, there's no exchange of products. You have a certificate, you're entitled, you get, okay, and there's cooperative, there's common ownership of the means of production. So in terms of the distributional effects of what it means to count as an hour of labor, this is it. Are there other aspects of what it might mean to count as an hour of labor? I mean, I think so, but we probably don't need to go into that.
So it's clear to me that Marx is saying that both this lower phase of communism and the higher phase of communism are both types of communism. They both have directly social labor, and they've negated the capitalist mode of production and replaced it with something else. So what exactly then is the difference between the higher and lower phase of communism?
Well, what he's getting at here, so I don't want to try to even speak in general what are the differences, but what he's saying is, okay, they have the same relations of production. As you said, labor is directly social. There's no production of value. There's no value. There's no money. There's no exchange of products. Means of production are held in common. Okay, so that's common to both the lower and higher phases of communist society. But what he's saying will differ in these two phases of the communist society is the relations of distribution. Okay, so this idea of you work an hour, you're entitled to an hour of products. That is what is corresponding to the lower phase of communist society. That's what's feasible, and only that much is feasible in a communist society when it's just starting out. To get to, the dreamed of stage where, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. Okay, to get to that, we need more than just a communist society. We need more than just labor being directly social, no value, no money, no exchange of products, common ownership of means of production. Okay, and the things that we need on top of that to eventually maybe arrive at this stage where you can have from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, you need a massive increase in productivity, in social wealth, just absolute abundance, absolute plenty, and you need a tremendous transformation of of the nature of work, so that work is no longer something that people look at as something I have to do, but it's something they want to do and enjoy and get satisfaction from. So that when they're working, they're not saying, well, how much am I getting in return? Okay, you really need a tremendous amount of wealth, and you need a tremendous transformation of the way in which work is done and the technology in order to make work not something that you do in order to get some reward for in return, but he says instead of just a means to life, it becomes life's prime want. The main thing that you want to do, you get up, you go, oh, cool, I can go to work. That's a long way off.
In just a moment, we will return to our discussion about Marx's critique of the Gotha program. But first, a few words from Anne Jacquard of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which hosts our podcast.
Hello, this is Anne Jacquard, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist-Humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses, whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marx's philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Today's political, economic, and environmental crises present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements, of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. We intend to practice, as well as espouse, a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice.
So we've talked about how both the lower and higher phase of communism, as described by Marx here, have directly social labor and are therefore not capitalist societies. But there are other interpretations of this text that one will run into where people consider the lower phase of communism to be some sort of transitional society, transitional mode of production, which is not fully capitalist or not fully communist. And I think the evidence, it seems, for that interpretation comes from these few sentences where Marx is talking about bourgeois right still being something that applies in the lower phase of communism.
Yeah, he's not. You don't believe he's saying that, but that's how they interpret it.
That's how people interpret it. That's sort of the textual evidence that people use to say that the lower phase is really like a transitional society and not a new society. You've written a decent amount about this, so maybe you should sort of explain what's going wrong with that.
And I think one thing that leads people off in this direction is that just like the people who, slapped together this Gotha program that Marx is opposing and the merger that is, based on these ideas that he's opposing of the two parties, just like them who are focused on the relations of distribution, who gets what, that's what these people focus on. So when they say, this is a different society, the lower phase and the higher phase, because they got different relations of distribution, that's the error right there. Okay.
Right. This is what we talked about earlier, that relations of distribution are secondary to relations of production.
And the lower and higher phases of communist society that Marx is talking about is belonging to one and the same society. They have the same relations of production, directly social labor, no value, etc., etc. There is a difference in terms of their relations of distribution, however. Why? Because to move to relations of distribution in which what you get is totally decoupled, independent of what you contribute, which is what we mean when we say from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. What does that mean? It means you give independent of what you get, and you get independent of what you give. Okay? To get to that stage, we need more than communist relations of production, directly social labor, no value, no exchange of products, common ownership. Those things alone are not sufficient to usher in this absolute break between what you give and what you get. What you need in addition is what I was saying before. You need tremendous abundance, untold wealth, and you need an absolute transformation of how work is done. So it becomes not something you have to do to get rewards, but something that you do because, hell, this is like cool. I'm doing work here, So it's just that certain things are needed in addition to communist relations of production to reach that form of distribution. That's all that's really going on as far as I can see.
So the other place in the text where people sometimes get this idea that Marx is considering the lower phase of communism to be some sort of transitional mode of production is this place later in the text in which he says, "Between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. There corresponds to this also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat." So people take that paragraph to mean that the lower phase is this transition period. What's wrong with this interpretation?
And they also think that the lower phase or something somehow is between capitalist and communist society. So there's like a double or triple or quadruple set of mistakes going on here. I mean, the one danger of that is to think of communist society in terms of distribution from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. That's not what Marx is talking about. Very clearly, it seems to me here, on the basis of the other parts of the text. I mean, that's one issue. The confusion of the politics and the nature of the society is another problem. There's all kinds of problems here. But the key to remember is that the lower phase and the higher phase of communism are phases of one society. They have the same relations of production. And that's how Marx always defines a socioeconomic formation or society, on the basis of its mode of production, which includes the relations of production. So we're talking, again, directly social labor, no value, no exchange of products, common ownership. Both the lower and higher phases are communist society, okay? And so he's saying between capitalism and between capitalist and communist society lies not some intermediate society, not some, mixed economy or whatever. In between that, you just have the transformation of the one into the other. No middle kind of society. Okay, you had capitalism, now you got communism. One gets transformed into the other. That's the social transformation. It's a revolutionary transformation. It's not gradual. It might take time, but it's not like piece by piece by piece. It's not gradual in that sense. Okay, so you can't there's no intermediate form of society between the two. Okay, but he says then in the next sentence, no longer talking about the revolutionary transformation of the mode of production. He now talks about the politics. He says corresponding to this is a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. So corresponding to the social economic transformation, he's saying there corresponds a political transition period. So in this period where you're moving between capitalism and communism, in this period where society is being transformed into what we've got now, from that into the lower phase of communism. Before we have the lower phase of communism, once we're starting to break with capitalist society, there's a political transition period in which there is still a state. And what is the state in these circumstances? When we're moving society, transforming it into this lower phase of communism, but we haven't gotten there, we have a state that is is the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. And I mean, that's a phrase that is just fraught with, misunderstandings and stuff because of the word dictatorship, but it doesn't mean, Trump, Putin, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, and that kind of stuff.
Right. And basically because the term dictatorship had a different connotation and meaning in Marx's day. And if I could, summarize, I would probably say that Marx is talking about not the rule of an individual over society, but of one part of society, one class over another. In a capitalist society, we have a dictatorship with a capitalist class, where they control, sort of have the greatest political influence or control over society. And in the dictatorship of the proletariat, this would be inverted, and the proletariat, the working class, would have control over society. Just in case it's not clear to people, we should go over why it's important to do away with this notion of a transitional society, of what the problems are with this idea.
Well, first of all, I think that, what people call the logic of capital, I think there is a logic of capital, a logic of capitalist society. It works a certain way, it has a certain structure, and it's totalizing. Okay, capitalism expands itself in more and more into every realm of life. So for instance, information is now a commodity, which it wasn't not all that long ago. I mean, just more and more every aspect of life. So how can this totalizing monster be sitting there in some mixed society, some intermediate society, alongside something that is absolutely antithetical to it? What kind of a society would you have? Or would you have, complete chaos and something that doesn't work? I think that you'd have the latter. You have to have capitalism or nothing, really, or a different society, right? But beyond that, to think of a transitional society in terms of Marx's body of thought, it just doesn't make sense, because as I keep coming back to this idea of his materialist conception of history, in which the foundation of the whole shebang is the mode of production, the relations of production, how people work, the forces of production, what they're working with. Okay, and on top of that, there arises, it meshes with, it corresponds to, you've got the distribution of income, of wealth, you've got the form of political association, state, or whatever, you've got the ideology, you've got the laws, all of it. It all is of a piece. Okay, now take that with the idea of, try to put that together with the idea of a transitional society. What is its mode of production? Okay, right? It would have to be a transitional mode of production if it's not going to be either just this unworkable mix of capitalist relations and communist relations. And it's just not feasible that the capitalist totality would not just crush the attempts to move this towards communism. It's just not possible. You just have chaos or worse. So you can think of various transitions, you can think of a transition like Marx was talking about. You can think of a transition from the state into the communist non-state. The transition is the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. You move from one, you transition more or less gradually, quickly, whatever, you transition from one to the other. Okay, but given that the relations of production and the forces, the mode, and everything that goes along with that in society is of a piece, there's no idea of a transition there, because it's the transformation of society that drives the transition. Okay, the transformation of the actual relations of production are driving the political transition. The political transition is corresponding to that transformation of society. Okay, but there's no. How do you speak of the transformation of society driving a transition of society? I mean, it doesn't even. It doesn't even make any sense. So when you think in the terms that Marx is thinking of, where the foundation of society is its mode of production, there's nothing that could impel a transition of the mode of production. Okay, it is the foundation, and its transformation is what allows other things to be in transition.
And that is all the time we have today on Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. If you want to hear more episodes, leave a comment, ask a question, or contact us. You can do that at Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. If you like the podcast, please do share with friends and leave us a rating on your favorite podcast platform.